Hey, welcome to Devotionables, brief devotions for busy people. My name is Derek Riley. I'm a BFG teacher here at 9th and O. We're starting this week on week 2 of the F260 Bible reading plan here at 9th and O. If you haven't been following along, this is the reading plan that we're using this year to read 260 key passages of the Bible together. We started last week and we're about 11 chapters into the reading plan now. So if you're reading along, congratulations, you finished the first week, and we can check that very satisfying box at the top of the sheet. If you haven't started reading with us yet, though, you can easily jump in right now. The reading pace isn't too demanding, and you could easily pick it up where we are right now, or even catch up on last week's reading without too much of a problem. As we start reading for week 2, though, we find ourselves in the middle of the book of Job. Last week we read chapters 1 and 2, which set the scene for us. The book begins by introducing us to Job, the greatest of all of the people of the East, we're told. We're told that Job is a very blessed man. He had lots of resources and a very large family that he loved and he cared for. He was also a righteous man. 3 times in that first chapter, we're told that Job is blameless and upright. Despite the fact that Job is blameless and upright, though, we all know that he would go on to face great loss and great heartache. In fact, we're told, even if Job never is, that he faces these horrible circumstances because he's blameless and upright. We're given a view of heaven that Job's not able to see, and we see that God is ruling and presiding over his creation. And the heavenly beings, including Satan, come before him there in his throne room. And in this peek behind the curtain, we see that God allows Satan to afflict Job. First by taking away his possessions, then by killing all of Job's children, and finally by afflicting Job's own health. In the intervening chapters that we're not going to read in the plan, Job cries out in his distress. He, at one point, even wishes that he had never been born. And then we get to hear a series of friends and counselors come and try to tell Job what caused these horrible things to happen. But in our reading today and tomorrow, we'll get to read the end of the book, which is when God shows up to speak to Job and to set the record straight. He doesn't tell Job everything, but he tells him exactly what Job needs to hear and what we need to hear when we face suffering. One of my favorite songwriters said that there's bound to come some trouble in this life, and he was right. When we live in this fallen, broken world, as we wait for the Lord to return and set all things back to right, we can be sure that at some point we will face suffering and anguish like Job. Maybe not to the same degree that Job did, but just as surely as he did. So when those times come, what do we do? What do we learn from Job? Very briefly, let me suggest 3 things to remember after we finish this book. First, Job tells us that even in our darkest moments, God is there. God hadn't forgotten Job. God hadn't abandoned Job. God was there with Job. God knew where he was, he knew what was going on, and when the time came, God was there to speak to Job. When we're facing terrible things, it's tempting to think that God has just forgotten about us or he's abandoned us, but Job will not let that lie stand. God is with us even then. Number 2, Job tells us that in our darkest moments, we don't have to look for someone to blame. When suffering and heartache come in our lives, we tend to think like Job's friends and counselors. We want to blame someone. Depending on the circumstances or our mood or even the time of day, we may decide to blame someone around us or to blame ourselves. But incredibly, we tend to think that if we can somehow figure out who to blame, that maybe we can make the situation better, or at least we would have a grasp on the situation, something that makes us feel more like we're in charge of what's going on. Now, don't get me wrong, there's sometimes when bad things happen in our life because of our sin. Sometimes it's somebody else's sin against us, but those circumstances are almost always clear. There's not ambiguity in those cases where we have to wonder and worry and search and try to find out what's going on. We know our sin. God's faithful to show us even if we don't. And those situations all fall under the realm of grace. Christ died so that those sins could be forgiven. There's grace even then. But much more often, just like in the book of Job, the answer is not that someone caused our sufferings or that someone needs to be blamed. Instead, we can trust God to understand what we never could and trust that He is in control in ways that we could never be. Which brings us to number 3. Job tells us that in our darkest moments, there is more at work than we could ever understand. When we're experiencing trouble in this life, we almost always want to ask why. But Job relieves us of that responsibility. Job tells us, you can't really understand it. Only God fully knows. God could have told Job more than he did. God could have told Job about what we saw in chapters 1 and 2. He could have told Job that this was all for God's own glory and to demonstrate Job's righteousness. He could have told Job that this was a spiritual attack as much as it was a physical one. And there's always what I wish I could scream back into these pages. God could have told Job that his suffering wasn't for nothing. God could have told Job that generation after generation for thousands of years would be encouraged and lifted up by his story. God could have told Job that his heartache would be there to comfort the heart of millions. But he didn't. God told Job that he couldn't possibly understand everything that was going on. And since Job couldn't understand it, he doesn't have to understand it. That burden is on God's shoulders, not on Job's. If Job could understand it or control it at all, if we could understand and control our suffering, we would be bearing up under a weight that we could never hold. But Job won't allow us to believe that lie that we have to understand what's going on. Instead, God's words to Job, the message of the whole book, beckons us to come and sit at the feet of the only one who can bear that weight. We don't have to understand why. We just have to trust in the God who does. He is good. He is there. From our darkest days to our greatest joys, he is there through it all, and we can trust him.